The detachment trap. Why spiritual bypassing will never lead to enlightenment. The lie of detachment equals enlightenment. Detachment has become the ultimate spiritual flex. Everyone's preaching, letting go, like it's the final boss of enlightenment. Except half the time, it's emotional anesthesia in a white robe. People call it inner peace, but look closer, it's just distance disguised as wisdom. It's a designer brand of not feeling anything too deeply. Somewhere along the way, spiritual practice turned into a beautifully marketed escape plan. And somehow, we started handing out gold stars for avoidance. Take a quick scroll through any online spiritual space. You'll find mantras like, release all that no longer serves you, or don't let negative energy lower your vibration. Sounds empowering, right? But behind that calm surface is often an unconscious message. Your humanity, your anger, sadness, anxiety, is a problem to be deleted. The more detached you seem, the more awakened people assume you are. But that's not awakening. That's repression in cosmic clothing. Here's the kicker. We've completely confused transcendence with avoidance. Real transcendence welcomes both pain and joy as parts of the same current. Avoidance hides behind serenity, terrified of life's mess. We've idolized monk-like stillness, but skipped the part where stillness is earned through suffering, not sidestepping it. Now, detachment isn't inherently bad. There's power in not being ruled by your emotions. But the cultural spin we've given it is off. What was meant to liberate has turned into control. It's become the spiritualized version of I'm fine. People strive to be unbothered instead of being self-aware. And in that process, they lose touch with genuine aliveness. Because here's the thing. Numbness can feel like peace when you've been drowning in noise, but that calm is counterfeit. It's silence built from disconnection, not awareness. Spirituality at its best teaches you to feel more, not less, to meet emotion without drowning in it. But modern spirituality sells a half-truth. Not reacting equals evolution. We confuse composure with awakening. There's a whole aesthetic of glassy-eyed calm, muted tones, slow talk, half smiles. It looks enlightened, but often it's just dissociation with good lighting. Here's the deeper problem. Emotional repression dressed as transcendence doesn't heal pain. It just buries it deeper. And buried pain doesn't disappear. It festers. That's why people who've been on the spiritual path for years still feel stuck, still secretly rage at the world, still cling to perfection. Because enlightenment without embodiment is fantasy. Pretty words floating above unhealed roots. You can meditate for a decade, but if you keep dodging grief or fear, your practice turns into an elegant avoidance system. We've glamorized detachment, like awakening means hiding behind glass. But anyone who's been through real transformation knows it's the opposite. True awakening slams you back into the body after years of floating away. It's shaking, crying, forgiving, and facing every wound you swore you were over. It's raw, not minimalist. Intimate, not sterile. And yet we live in a time where detachment has been rebranded into lifestyle philosophy. You'll find it everywhere, from high-vibe influencers selling calmness candles to YouTubers warning you not to absorb negative energy, like it's contagious. The message is clear, safe spirituality feels good. But the truth is, safety and growth rarely coexist. You can't meditate your way out of what you refuse to feel. You can't let go of what you've never actually let in. The obsession with constant positivity has turned into a digital religion. Good vibes only is practically scripture now. But this pseudo-stoicism robs people of their humanity. Real emotional work looks messy, contradictory, and profoundly human. It's not photogenic. It doesn't sell courses. But it's the only path that actually leads somewhere real. The irony? Real detachment isn't emotional absence. It's emotional freedom. It's the power to face the storm without losing center. But no one sells that nuance. The culture prefers numbness. Don't take things personally. Don't feed negativity. Be the observer. Those lines sound enlightened, but often operate like armor. We end up studying our emotions like lab subjects instead of living them. That's not healing. That's self-suppression rebranded as serenity. Psychologically, this makes perfect sense. Our nervous systems crave regulation. When life feels chaotic, being detached is soothing. It offers the illusion of stability. But when we mistake suppression for serenity, we actually reinforce the same fear that drove us to avoid feeling in the first place. We build a temple out of avoidance and call it enlightenment. I've lost count of how many people brag. Nothing gets to me anymore, like apathy's a flex. They really believe that's growth. But emotion isn't a nuisance, it's intel. Every feeling, anger, shame, tenderness, maps the parts of you still waiting to be seen. To suppress them for high frequency is to split your soul in half, trying to ascend while you've still got yourself chained in the basement. If we look closely, this glorified detachment fits perfectly with the times we live in. It's spiritual stoicism customized for burnout. People are overwhelmed, overstimulated, and emotionally exhausted, so detachment sounds like salvation. It's the clean, unmessy version of help. But what it really does is cut them off from inner dialogue. You can't heal what you refuse to hear. This good vibes-only culture also keeps us disconnected from collective suffering. When we silence pain under the guise of being above negativity, we become apathetic to injustice. Spirituality then loses its moral depth. It becomes individualistic, performative, shallow. True awakening expands compassion, but bypassing shrinks it. It becomes about me and my vibration instead of us and our humanity. And that's the pivotal insight here. Detachment without empathy is just another prison. You might escape personal pain, but you also escape connection, meaning, and intimacy. You trade suffering for emptiness. That's why so many people on the so-called path eventually hit a quiet existential wall. They've transcended themselves right out of life. So when we applaud the image of detachment as the height of evolution, we're really rewarding avoidance. We mistake the absence of emotion for mastery. But real mastery looks messy. It's tears in meditation, it's laughter after grief, it's patience with imperfection. It's the courage to stay with what hurts until it transforms you. Maybe the real spiritual practice isn't about being untouchable. It's about being reachable. To let life move through you without resistance. Detachment, in its original essence, was never meant to disconnect. It was meant to humble. To remind you that you are not your emotions, but you are also not above them. So if detachment today feels hollow, that's because somewhere along the way, we started worshipping control instead of awareness. We called repression enlightenment. And now, a generation of seekers are chasing peace by cutting out half of their humanity. That's why, though everyone's talking about awakening, most of what passes for it now looks more like sedation. But where did this bypassing mindset actually begin? How did we twist ancient teachings about awareness into rituals of avoidance? To understand that, we have to go back to where the concept first took shape, to a time when the spiritual movement became less about wholeness and more about appearing healed. And that's where the story of spiritual bypassing really begins. The birth of spiritual bypassing. Before good vibes only became a brand, the idea of spiritual bypassing started as an observation in a therapist's office. In the late 197s, psychologist John Welwood noticed something strange among his otherwise devoutly sincere Buddhist students. These were people devoted to mindfulness, meditation, and compassion. But under all that calm was unresolved pain. They spoke in enlightened metaphors but avoided their anger, grief, or shame like it was unspiritual. Welwood coined the term spiritual bypassing to describe the use of spiritual beliefs or practices to sidestep uncomfortable emotions instead of facing them. It wasn't a cynical critique of spirituality. It was a compassionate diagnosis. He saw how people weaponized teachings like let it go or everything happens for a reason to avoid inner work. That's the seed from which today's pseudo-peace culture grew. Because what began as a sincere pursuit of liberation was quietly hijacked by the human instinct to run from pain. When Eastern traditions began flowing into Western culture around the 190s XXS and 70s, the translation was selective, to say the least. The West loved the tranquility of Eastern imagery, the serene monks, the meditating Buddhas, the promise of stillness, but kind of skipped the thousands of hours of inner excavation that actually built that peace. Meditation was imported, emotional maturity, not so much. The teachings of non-attachment turned into catchphrases stripped of context. You are not your thoughts sounded liberating, but people started using it as don't deal with your thoughts. Basically, we took the most difficult parts of spiritual wisdom, self-confrontation, humility, ego dissolution, and turned them into slogans that made us feel enlightened without actually changing. The result? A spirituality that comforted the mind but ignored the heart. In traditional Buddhist philosophy, detachment means observing without clinging. It never meant feeling nothing. But when that idea met Western individualism, the culture of self-optimization and convenience, it mutated. Meditation became productivity. Mindfulness became mood regulation. And inner peace turned into a consumer experience. The West cherry-picked the aesthetic of Zen and left the discipline behind. We heard don't be attached and translated it as don't care. And this isn't just about East versus West. It's about how human beings tend to edit truth in our favor. We keep the parts that soothe and discard the ones that challenge us. So when modern seekers encountered texts about transcending suffering, it was tempting to misread that as you can avoid suffering altogether. The nuance, that transcendence comes through meeting suffering fully, got lost somewhere between yoga studios and bookstore self-help aisles. Think about the rise of New Age self-help around the same time. Books promising instant inner peace, affirmations replacing emotional processing, weekend workshops on how to manifest your higher self. It all sounds inspiring, but so much of it grew from the same soil, people desperate not to feel broken. The bypass was already forming. Use spiritual ideals as a bridge to avoid facing wounds. Why dig into trauma when you can just tell yourself, it's all energy? By the 198s and 90s, spiritual bypassing had gone mainstream through westernized yoga, positive thinking, and light-oriented practices. The language of enlightenment began sounding suspiciously like the language of avoidance. Think higher thoughts. Don't dwell on negativity. Detach from emotion. The subtle message, feeling deeply, makes you spiritually immature. But that's the exact opposite of what ancient teachings intended. Emotion wasn't the enemy. Ignorance of emotion was. The psychology behind this trend is clear. Humans are safety-driven creatures. Spiritual ideas become convenient tools for protection. If feeling grief threatens your sense of equilibrium, labeling grief as low vibration instantly protects you from falling apart. It's a beautiful illusion, one that shields the ego from discomfort while pretending it's dissolving it. That's what John Welwood saw, people turning profound teachings into defense mechanisms. Instead of fostering awareness, they used spirituality to maintain control. When someone said, "I'm not angry, I'm in acceptance," he often found repressed rage hiding under the mantra. The phrase, "I've let it go," really meant, "I've buried it alive." From there, spiritual bypassing spread wherever growth met capitalism. Self-help authors found there was profit in emotional anesthesia. Why tell people to face shadow work when you can sell them a formula for eternal calm? It was hope marketed as transcendence, and it worked, because bypassing feels good at first. No inner storms, no messy emotions, just light. But light without shadow is blinding. And soon, it wasn't just gurus or authors promoting it. The culture itself absorbed bypassing as a worldview. Corporations adopted mindfulness to increase productivity, not emotional well-being. Wellness coaches preached, everything is mindset, while subtly ignoring systemic suffering. The original purpose of detachment, to reduce ego's control, was flipped into another ego trick. I'm too evolved to be affected. That phrase right there became the quiet epidemic. People started striving for spiritual immunity instead of spiritual maturity. And since nobody wants to look unevolved, bypassing became socially rewarded. You're so zen started meaning you don't react. We measure awakening by how little someone feels instead of how deeply they engage. This is where today's distorted understanding of enlightenment was born. A generation learned to wear calm like armor. People learned to smile through heartbreak, chant through trauma, float through grief. And all the while, bypassing whispered the same lie. If you were truly spiritual, this wouldn't hurt. But pain isn't proof of failure, it's the doorway to awareness. So ironically, what began as a bridge to divinity became a wall against authenticity. Spiritual bypassing promised transcendence, but delivered suppression. The West embraced no attachment and conveniently forgot deep compassion. We exported the symbols and forgot the soul of the teachings. And that's how a simple misunderstanding, mistaking awareness for avoidance, evolved into a cultural philosophy of pseudo-calm. It started with sincere seekers trying to find peace and ended with influencers selling vibration-raising crystals. The lineage of bypassing runs from ancient monasteries through New Age bookstores, all the way to Instagram feeds filled with pastel quotes about letting go. Understanding that history matters, because once we see how it warped, we can stop repeating it. The problem isn't spirituality, it's selective spirituality, the kind that edits out humanity to appear enlightened. And that distortion didn't vanish with the 70s. It just rebranded itself for modern consumption. And now, in our hyper-aesthetic age, that old bypassing instinct has put on a fresh face, one that's filtered, hashtagged, and monetized. It's not hiding in monasteries anymore. It's hiding in plain sight on your Explore page. The new face of avoidance. Spiritual bypassing didn't vanish when the New Age weekend workshops died out. It just put on better lighting and learned how to monetize. Now avoidance dresses itself up in the sleek vocabulary of alignment, manifestation, and energetic boundaries. Think of the influencers sipping matcha, whispering about releasing low-frequency thoughts, while their undiagnosed panic disorder edits every take. The sound is soothing, the script is sanctimonious, and the fear of feeling still runs the show. Modern spirituality is less a path and more a brand kit. Sage, sun flares, beige linen, perfect detachment. Every emotion has to pass the vibe check. Pain just isn't on brand. Scroll any conscious living account and you'll see curated calm. Tears are fine if they sparkle under ring light. The goal isn't depth anymore, it's optics. Real vulnerability can't compete with the aesthetic of serenity. Peace performs better than presence, so people fake it. Take the phrase, raise your vibration. At its core, it points toward awareness, choosing responses rooted in love rather than fear. But online it's been hollowed out into a mood management strategy. Raising your vibration now means suppressing anything that doesn't feel good. Anger? Lower frequency. Grief? Dense energy. So you smile wider, breathe deeper, and shove discomfort into another dimension. The irony is that chasing high vibes becomes the surest way to flatten your emotional spectrum. Joy without tension loses meaning, yet that's exactly what the culture rewards. Then came the corporate merger between hustle and healing. The same mindset that worships optimization swallowed spirituality whole. Hack your vibration. Upgrade your energy. Crush your limiting beliefs before Q3. The result is an industry of overachieving mystics, people treating transcendence like a KPI. Still feeling grief? Must be an alignment issue. The answer? Another course, another subscription, another retreat. Spiritual growth turned into a spreadsheet, and burnout now wears mullah beads. Good vibes only functions like an HR policy for the soul, polite but deeply repressive. It trains people to manage perception rather than reality. You can't complain because that lowers the room's frequency. You can't be afraid because that blocks abundance. It's a spiritual performance review, and everyone's scared of failing it. Beneath the endless affirmations is quiet shame for being human. The vocabulary reinforces the avoidance. Toxic energy, energy vampires, empaths versus unhealed people. Labels that once described boundaries now act as filters that remove discomfort. Someone challenges you, they're negative. Feel sadness? You've fallen in vibration. It's emotional gentrification, clearing out all the rough feelings to keep the neighborhood of consciousness clean and profitable. But healing isn't a real estate project. It's demolition and rebuilding at the same time. This sanitized spirituality fits perfectly into our economy of appearances. Platforms reward aesthetics, not authenticity. The calmer you look, the more enlightened you seem. So people learn to repress tension for the algorithm. Meditation clips get likes. Emotional honesty gets muted. Slowly, expression shrinks until all that's left is smiley stoicism. What you see is composure, but what you don't see is constriction, breath held in the name of grace. Psychologically, the consequences are subtle but real. When authentic emotion becomes taboo, the psyche compensates through dissociation. People start mistaking neutrality for enlightenment. They confuse emotional flatness with balance. The nervous system might be frozen, but the caption says, inner peace achieved. It's aesthetic trauma, the body's shutdown presented as serenity. This new spiritual avoidance doesn't look like denial, it looks photogenic. Consider the popular mantra, forgive and forget. True forgiveness requires confronting the harm, processing the grief, integrating the lesson. Forgetting skips all that. Yet social media sells it as instant virtue. If you're still angry, you haven't evolved. So people rush forgiveness, paste love over resentment, and call the result maturity. It's spiritual fast food, tastes fine, has no nutrients. Even therapy spaces feel the influence. Clients apologize for being upset. I know I shouldn't be in that low vibration. That's bypassing internalized as morality. Our emotional honesty gets measured against an invisible meter of worthiness. The lesson from the culture: serenity equals value, struggle equals failure. But genuine growth is nonlinear. It involves relapse, contradiction, mess. A nervous breakdown might be more authentic than 1,000 mantras. Yet the algorithm never shows that part. Behind the polished captions, many sincerely believe they're doing the right thing. They meditate daily, script manifestations, keep gratitude journals. These are beautiful practices until they become compulsions to avoid awareness. You can't manifest your way out of what you refuse to acknowledge. Every affirmation written to bury grief becomes another brick in the wall between self and self. Somewhere, the original intention, connection with something larger, shrinks down to mood control. The commercialization of calm also feeds spiritual elitism. When tranquility costs money, retreats, crystals, subscriptions, peace becomes a status symbol. Serenity gets gate-kept by privilege. The influencer, who never looks messy, starts representing enlightenment itself. But that image pressures followers to mimic detachment rather than embody openness. It's not, how can I be more conscious? It's, how can I look less affected? This aesthetic extends into language policing. People afraid of speaking negativity into existence censor their stories. Even authentic despair becomes rephrased as contrast. The goal shifts from healing to managing optics. Pain gets PR training. And so community support weakens, because everyone pretends to be fine. When everyone is performing evolution, nobody feels safe admitting collapse. Meanwhile, genuine discomfort gets banished like bad press. But suppression doesn't vanish, it metastasizes. It leaks out sideways as burnout, mystery illness, or quiet resentment behind those gratitude posts. That supposedly high vibration? Often emotional frostbite. You can smudge all you want, but fear doesn't dissolve in sage smoke. It just waits for silence to end. The deeper tragedy is collective. When people label societal pain as low vibration, they disengage from change. Injustice becomes karmic rather than human. They're just manifesting that reality replaces empathy. Spiritual avoidance then becomes political anesthesia. Real compassion demands proximity to suffering, but the current trend worships insulation. The heart can't expand when it's wrapped in plastic positivity. Still, awareness is spreading. Many seekers are starting to notice the emptiness behind performative peace. They're realizing that no amount of vibe curation replaces honest feeling. Some are turning back toward embodiment, trauma-informed practice, and grounded spirituality that doesn't fear tears. That shift matters. It signals maturity. Because eventually everyone discovers that chasing bliss ends at the same dead end, numbness. The only way out is through sensation again. So this new face of avoidance, manicured calm, algorithmic light, perpetual forgiveness, reveals how far we'll go to avoid being human. We've rebranded repression as refinement. But beneath every pastel affirmation lives the same old human truth. Feeling hurts, and we're scared of it. Yet that fear is exactly where awakening starts. Which brings us to the psychological side of the story. What's actually happening inside when someone bypasses their emotions, believing it's enlightenment? The psychology of emotional evasion. When someone insists they're above their emotions, that's not enlightenment. It's neurobiology pulling the strings. The brain is excellent at self-protection, and emotional suppression is one of its oldest defense mechanisms. When we experience pain, especially in childhood, the nervous system learns two things. Emotions can be dangerous, and control keeps us safe. So decades later, when spiritual teachings come along promising peace through detachment, the brain quietly rejoices. It's found a socially acceptable way to keep avoiding the sensations it never learned to handle. Suppression feels logical because it works, temporarily. Tighten the muscles, flatten the breath, and the emotion fades from awareness. The body stores it instead, like unprocessed mail dumped in the basement. From the outside, this looks like calm. The person meditating, smiling gently, insisting they've released attachment. Inside, cortisol still trickles through their bloodstream. The body's alarm system is humming quietly while the mind performs serenity. That gap, between felt experience and expressed appearance, is the psychological signature of bypassing. Bypassing is basically trauma's PR department. It mimics coping mechanisms perfectly. Under threat, your system flips between fight, flight, or freeze. Zen bypassing? It's usually the luxury edition of a freeze response. Instead of battling or running, the psyche shuts down arousal under a cloak of spiritual language. I'm surrendering often means I'm dissociating. Energy leaves the body, speech slows, emotions flatten. To friends, it looks peaceful. To a therapist, it looks like numbing. The person isn't lying. They really believe they're calm. But the calmness is mechanical, not mindful. Think about the common expression. You can't hurt me anymore. I'm at peace. On paper, that sounds mature. But when tone is clipped and eyes glaze, what you're seeing is the protective reflex of emotional anesthesia. The brain confuses stillness with safety. The problem is, freezing blocks not only pain but pleasure, curiosity, and empathy, the full bandwidth of being alive. Emotional evasion secures short-term stability, while long-term aliveness quietly erodes. Take an everyday example. Someone feels betrayed by a friend. Instead of confronting the hurt, they quote a spiritual line. Everything happens for a reason. The phrase works like a tranquilizer. Within minutes the tension drops, but so does access to honesty. Beneath that mantra, the nervous system is still bracing for rejection. The hurt isn't gone, it's archived. A month later, intimacy triggers unease, and they don't know why. That's bypassing in motion. Unresolved feeling disguised as philosophical insight. Here's the paradox. Bypassing promises transcendence, but delivers entrapment. Every repressed emotion becomes an internal ghost haunting present-day reactions. Anger that isn't expressed turns into chronic fatigue. Grief avoided morphs into apathy. Fear denied resurfaces as control issues or perfectionism. The psyche doesn't delete, it recycles. Each bypassed emotion becomes a shape-shifting symptom until it's finally felt. Neurologically, emotions are chemical events designed to finish a cycle. Rise, crest, release. When we interrupt that sequence by overriding sadness with positivity, we trap biochemical energy midstream. The body then holds unfinished fight or flight responses in muscles and fascia. People call it tight shoulders from stress, but it's often literally the residue of feelings that never got permission to finish their sentences. Spiritual bypassing institutionalizes this freeze, teaching stillness before safety, silence before regulation. You can hear the slip in the way people talk. The tone softens into monotone, the vocabulary drips with abstraction. It's all perfect. I'm witnessing the ego. Those aren't lies, they're protective scripts. The mind performs detachment to prevent flooding. What's missing is embodiment, breath movement, trembling, tears. Without sensation, awareness becomes surveillance, watching emotion instead of meeting it. That's not transcendence, that's avoidance with good posture. I've seen clients who meditate daily, yet feel hollow. They begin sessions saying, "I think I'm too calm." Too calm is the giveaway sign. Healthy regulation is texture. Someone still laughs, still gets irritated, still responds. Chronic neutrality, on the other hand, signals shutdown. The nervous system has mistaken numbness for nirvana. It's as if the body unplugged every circuit labeled too intense and called the resulting dim light enlightenment. The most dangerous twist? Bypassing wins applause. People praise the friend who never complains, the partner who always stays centered. We mistake emotional silence for wisdom. But wisdom requires self-knowledge, and self-knowledge cannot grow in suppression. A monk's composure emerges after years of sitting with suffering, not hiding from it. Bypassing tries to skip ahead to the after photo without living the process. The calm voice hiding rage is a classic case study. Someone meditates instead of expressing conflict. They say, "Anger is ego, and I won't feed it." The real translation: anger feels unsafe, so I'm pretending it's gone. But anger's biological role is boundary protection. When it's repressed, boundaries erode, resentment builds invisibly, and eventually spills as passive aggression or chronic withdrawal. The person appears peaceful right until something minor triggers volcanic reaction. The volcano was never gone, it was just anesthetized. Then there's the passive smile concealing grief. Culture praises grace in adversity, so people learn to mask loss with phrases like, "I know they're in a better place." That belief might be true, but when it becomes a shield against tears, healing pauses. Grief metabolizes only through expression, trembling, crying, reaching out. Without that movement, sorrow becomes existential fatigue, the sense of being half alive even in pleasant moments. Bypassing is emotional sleepwalking. Remember those moments in your own life when you said, "I'm fine," and genuinely thought you were? That's bypassing in plain sight. "I'm fine" is code for "I'm surviving." It marks the exact second emotion gets pushed underground. Over time, the habit automates itself. Every strong feeling gets labeled as regression. Eventually, you can't tell the difference between equilibrium and emptiness. And the scary part? The world will applaud your composure while your inner world quietly ossifies. Psychologically, bypassing keeps wounds alive by starving them of oxygen. Emotions need acknowledgement to complete. Imagine a wound that's never cleaned. Looks sealed, but infection smolders beneath. That infection is unprocessed emotion. It distorts perception, colors relationships, and limits empathy. The very practice meant to create peace ends up breeding fragmentation. This isn't to demonize calmness. True serenity is possible, but it's earned through integration, not evasion. When calm follows contact with emotion, it's regulation. When calm comes from suppression, it's paralysis wearing meditation beads. The distinction is internal. One expands sensation, the other contracts it. In conscious awareness, breath deepens. In bypass, breath disappears. Our biology proves it. A regulated nervous system shows variability, heart rate rising and falling fluidly. A bypass system stays locked in flat patterns. That rigidity leaks into behavior. People become over-controlled, terrified of vulnerability, allergic to spontaneity. They confuse predictability with safety. Real awakening, though, requires flexibility, the willingness to be moved. Ironically, bypassing fails because emotions don't need permission, they need space. Push them down and they grow louder, often returning as anxiety dreams, body pain, or intrusive thoughts. That's the psyche knocking, reminding you the job's unfinished. The spiritual facade eventually cracks, not because the path was false, but because avoidance can't sustain wholeness. So the next time serenity feels suspiciously sterile, pause and check. Is this peace or paralysis? If the calm costs you connection, curiosity, or joy, it's likely the latter. True awakening doesn't mute emotion. It amplifies awareness around it. The process feels messy precisely because the frozen parts of self are thawing. That trembling isn't regression, it's revival. And ironically, the only way out of bypassing is through embodied honesty. Noticing the tension, letting the tears make sense of silence, allowing the storm until it settles naturally. Because every spiritual defense mechanism is just an old wound asking to be felt. Once you realize that, avoidance loses its power, and the emotion you feared most becomes the doorway back to yourself. When healing becomes identity, at some point along the self-help highway, healing stopped being a journey and became a personal brand. We started treating recovery like an aesthetic. Zen tones, affirmation fonts, bruises disguised as wisdom quotes. The idea was beautiful in theory. Heal yourself, grow, transcend. But in practice, it morphed into a competition. Healing became a badge of worthiness, a lifestyle brand where the goal wasn't wholeness anymore. It was looking evolved enough to be admired. You can see it everywhere. Healing journey, hashtags. Influencers journaling beside sage smoke. Even in private conversations, people talk like they're applying for a role in the enlightened Olympics. I've done the work. I'm holding space. I've released that wound. It's not that these phrases are wrong. It's that they've become currency. The language of therapy and spirituality now doubles as social capital. The more you can articulate your transformation, the more legitimate your growth seems. But real healing rarely looks polished enough for captions. Real healing is sobbing at 2 a.m. because an old memory punched through your meditation playlist. Here's the paradox. Healing culture began with empowerment, yet somehow slid into performance. It promises endless evolution, but keeps you perpetually in progress. There's always another workshop, another layer, another retreat promising to peel back what's blocking your light. It's the self-improvement treadmill, progress framed as presence. If you ever feel done, you're seen as complacent. So instead of healing to live, people live to heal. Psychologically, that endless pursuit offers a false sense of safety. As long as you're working on yourself, you avoid confronting the big unknown, who you are without a wound to fix. Pain becomes identity's anchor. You cling to your trauma narrative the way others cling to status symbols. I'm healing from replaces I am. And the ego, ever adaptable, proudly rebrands itself as the healer. It's superior yet humble, compassionate yet subtly condescending. A persona built from self-awareness that's lost its humility. This is the moment when spiritual bypassing shapeshifts. It stops pretending to be detachment and starts masquerading as mastery. The new script goes like this. I've integrated my shadow. I don't attract that energy anymore. On the surface, it sounds strong. Underneath, it's still avoidance, a wish to never feel triggered again. People chase immunity instead of intimacy. They think enlightenment is emotional invulnerability, not emotional literacy. Scroll through the self-help market, and you'll see how profitable that mindset is. There are endless programs promising to heal your inner child in 7 days, or quantum leap past trauma. The repetition keeps customers hooked because it feeds on insecurity. If wholeness were achievable, the business model would collapse. So healing becomes a subscription plan. Monthly renewals of still not enough. And every purchase reinforces the lie that growth means distance from pain. Even communities built for authenticity fall into this trap. Group circles where vulnerability is graded by eloquence. People compete over their emotional vocabulary. I'm somatically releasing ancestral grief. The spectacle of healing overshadows the substance. It feels inclusive but subtly hierarchical. Who cries the most? Who forgives fastest? Who glows hardest afterward? We've turned intimacy into performance art. The algorithm amplifies it further. Posts labeled raw and unfiltered are often meticulously staged. Tears sparkle under ring lights. Captions about feeling it all coexist with affiliate links. None of this negates sincere intention, but it blurs sincerity itself. Viewers absorb the message that authenticity equals visibility. You're not just healing, you're producing content about healing. In a world where connection is quantified, silence looks like regression. But the deepest growth usually happens offline, unseen, in moments too unmarketable to share. This chronic display of progress also breeds comparison. If everyone else seems radiant, your own messy process starts to feel wrong. People fall into healing shame, judging themselves for still hurting. They forget that integration doesn't erase emotion. It reshapes your relationship with it. Grief revisits, anger stirs, and that's normal. But online spirituality frames recurrence as relapse. The subtle message: evolution must be linear. So when chaos reappears, people hide it to maintain the facade. That's bypassing disguised as discipline. Notice how language reinforces superiority. I've ascended past third density drama. They're still unhealed. The dichotomy of healed versus unhealed replaces the old morality of good versus bad. It's separation wearing a halo. People start policing vibes like priests once policed sin. The moment you label someone toxic, you eliminate complexity, and by extension, real empathy. Healing becomes a border instead of a bridge. Guru culture thrives on this division. The teacher who claims to have transcended suffering ends up attracting followers desperate for shortcuts. Both sides feed each other's illusions. The guru's authority depends on appearing healed, and the follower's hope depends on believing perfection exists. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, the enlightened influencer still battles the same fears they preach against. The performance demands repression, so bypassing grows silently backstage. Some might argue that performance isn't all bad, that pretending confidence can eventually create it. True, but when the costume fuses to the skin, identity hardens. You stop updating your understanding of yourself, because admitting change would threaten the brand. That's emotional stagnation, disguised as serenity. Instead of evolving through vulnerability, you curate strength and call it healed. The social reward structure seals the trap. People cheer your composure more than your honesty. They celebrate your calm while ignoring the cost of it. You're handling it so well becomes applause for suppression. Eventually, authenticity feels risky, equanimity feels safe. But sterile composure is not enlightenment. It's emotional minimalism. We've confused flatness with freedom. The irony is that real healing makes you softer, not sleeker. It widens your range instead of narrowing it. You cry more, laugh louder, forgive slower but deeper. Growth doesn't mean erasing edges, it means loving them. That nuance, though, doesn't fit neatly into trend culture. Vulnerability, without aesthetic appeal, rarely goes viral. So the market keeps promoting the streamlined version, clean, symmetrical, profitable. At its worst, healing as identity fuels narcissistic empathy. People broadcast compassion to prove advancement, not to connect. They attend others' pain like tourists, taking inspiration selfies before leaving. Everyone's reflecting, but no one's relating. Awareness becomes performance art, where humility should live. The psychological cost is alienation. When your sense of self depends on appearing evolved, any relapse into raw emotion feels like identity death. You start editing conversations, policing your tone, apologizing for humanity. But suppression wrapped in spiritual language is still suppression. It doesn't end suffering, it just makes it fashionable. And here's the quiet tragedy. The more you identify as healed, the farther you drift from genuine growth. Because growth requires friction, admitting not knowing, exposing cracks. Once you stake your worth on appearing whole, you stop learning. The ego wins again, cleverly disguised as liberation. So maybe the point of healing was never to become the healed person. Maybe it was to remember your humanness so deeply that no label sticks. To let transformation be transient, not trademarked. When you can cry without a caption, hold pain without narrating it, and meet imperfection without flinching, that's the space where real awakening begins to breathe again. And that's exactly what we need to explore next. If all this performance blocks transformation, what does authentic awakening actually look like when it's no longer curated but lived? The anatomy of true awakening. If the show of healing keeps us frozen, real awakening is what happens when the costume burns off and there's nowhere left to hide. It's what happens when the spiritual costume burns off. The beginner's mistake is thinking awakening means escaping emotion. The truth is far less cinematic. Awakening happens when we run out of ways to avoid ourselves. It's not ascending above the storm. It's realizing you are the storm and the sky holding it. Awakening isn't about perfect calm, it's about capacity. It measures how much truth you can handle without shutting down. Enlightenment isn't an escape hatch from the human experience. It's an expansion within it. Every tradition worth its salt eventually points there. Awareness through inclusion. You don't transcend sadness by deleting it. You become vast enough to contain it. You don't conquer fear by ignoring it. You meet it until it unravels into understanding. The shift feels subtle but seismic. Instead of asking, "How do I stop feeling this?" Awakening asks, "Can I stay present while feeling this?" Most people never make that turn. They chase neutrality, confusing it with wisdom. Yet authentic awakening expands your emotional palette. It doesn't desaturate it. A truly awakened person can grieve fully and still see beauty. A paradox that sanitized spirituality can't comprehend. This is where shadow work enters, and not as a hashtag. The shadow isn't evil. It's every aspect of ourselves exiled by shame. Real awakening demands meeting those banished emotions like long-lost children. Anger, envy, fear. They're not obstacles but invitations. When brought into awareness, they stop acting out through projection. Integration transforms them from saboteurs into allies. Jung understood this deeply. Enlightenment comes from making the darkness conscious, not denying its existence. To meet the shadow is to reclaim your stolen wholeness. Differentiating detachment from dissociation becomes crucial here. Detachment is presence without clinging, a witness stance rooted in compassion. Dissociation is absence masquerading as calm, a physiological exit from sensation. Outwardly, they look identical. Two people meditating might seem equally serene. One is grounded in breath, feeling body and emotion flow. The other is hovering somewhere behind their eyes, numb. The test is embodiment. Can you feel the floor beneath you when peace arrives, or does it float above life? Psychology meets spirituality, right at that crossroads. Detachment still feels connected. You sense heartbreak, but aren't drowned in it. You watch thought without believing every story. It's awareness anchored in the body. Dissociation, on the other hand, severs that tether. Awareness becomes surveillance, seeing but not touching. True awakening integrates sensation, cognition, and emotion into one coherent stream. Anything less is escape. Consider how authentic teachers modeled this. The Buddha reached enlightenment after facing the world's suffering head-on. He didn't bypass Mara's temptations. He sat through them until they lost power. Ram Dass, decades later, spoke openly about his own neuroses and heartbreak, teaching that loving awareness includes embarrassment and confusion. Even Jung insisted his mystical experiences grew from wrestling with inner chaos, not escaping it. None of them preached immunity. They embodied inclusion, allowing everything to belong. Awakening through inclusion doesn't start blissful. It usually feels like demolition day. The ego resists integration because shadows threaten its control. This friction is what mystics call the dark night of the soul. Old defenses fall apart. Coping mechanisms stop working. It's the soul's puberty, messy, necessary, humbling. Most seekers bail at this point, mistaking disorientation for failure. Yet that breakdown is the birth canal of consciousness. The motives that once drove bypassing, safety, image, certainty, get stripped away. What remains is naked awareness, unadorned by story. Awakening is equal parts body and spirit. The nervous system has to upgrade its software to hold that presence. That's why embodied practices matter. Breath work, shaking, crying, they're not indulgent. They're rewiring tools. Each tremor trains the body that it's safe to stay during intensity. Without this somatic participation, awakening stays theoretical, floating in the intellect. Real transformation happens when insight descends from head to heart to gut. Integration over denial is the heart of the journey. Denial fragments the psyche. Integration stitches it back. When you permit every feeling into consciousness, awareness becomes a spacious container rather than a spotlight. You stop managing experience and start listening to it. That shift rewrites the emotional script. Anger signals violated values, Guilt points to integrity gaps, grief honors love. Nothing is enemy territory anymore. Even anxiety becomes a messenger. Energy wanting expression, not extinction. Most traditions use paradox to describe this state, because logic can't. You're simultaneously surrendered and empowered, empty yet full, humble yet luminous. Awareness stops serving ego's agenda and becomes a quiet field where everything combusts into clarity. You recognize that peace isn't the absence of disturbance, it's the rhythm beneath it. That realization changes everything, not by removing difficulty, but by dissolving the illusion that difficulty means distance from the divine. In everyday life, this looks less mystical and more ordinary. Listening instead of fixing, crying without shame, setting boundaries from empathy rather than control. It's the ability to hold joy while dishes pile in the sink, to pray from heartbreak, to laugh mid-panic. True awakening decentralizes perfection. It says, nothing disqualifies you from awareness. Even regression becomes part of the curriculum. Awareness as radical inclusion means you no longer outsource authority to teachers or systems. You start trusting direct experience more than spiritual theory. The practice becomes intimate self-honesty. What's real right now, and can I stay with it? Each moment becomes an altar. Washing dishes, arguing, resting, all reveal facets of consciousness. Enlightenment stops being a mountaintop event and becomes daily integration. But confronting shadow triggers fear because it dismantles identity. The self built on avoidance can't survive real contact with pain. This unraveling feels like ego death, and it is, though not the glamorous kind sung about in retreats. It's small deaths. Realizing forgiveness can't erase anger. Watching stories dissolve one by one until even the awakened one disappears. What's left is presence, untitled, responsive, alive. Here lies the irony that few mention. The ego will sometimes wear enlightenment as camouflage. It claims, I've transcended desire, while secretly craving recognition for it. Humility becomes the next frontier. Real awakening doesn't feel superior, it feels available. It brings you closer to humanity, not further. You cry easier, apologize faster, laugh deeper. The line between sacred and mundane fades until compassion feels automatic. Awakening, then, is messy integration, not immaculate ascension. It's the willingness to let awareness touch every hidden place, even when it stings. Each confrontation with shadow expands capacity for love. The more darkness you can behold without flinching, the more light you can embody without burning out. That's the anatomy of true awakening. Inclusion, not evasion. Embodiment, not escape. And the next truth is uncomfortable but liberating. Once you start dismantling illusions, the ego doesn't surrender gracefully. It mutates. It turns its survival instinct into spiritual language. That clever pivot is what happens next, and understanding it is key to keeping the journey real. The ego's last defense. Here's where it gets funny, in a cosmic, slightly tragic way. Even when you think you've dissolved your ego, it's usually just backstage, wearing a halo and taking notes on how to survive your enlightenment. Spiritual bypassing is often the ego's smartest disguise. It whispers things like, I'm beyond my emotions, or I've transcended the self, not to awaken you, but to survive inside your awakening. It's ego preservation dressed up as ego death. Think about how seductive that language is. Ego dissolution, non-self, oneness. These ideas sound profound, but the moment you assume you've achieved them, the ego quietly claps. It loves specialness, even the enlightened kind. That quiet voice saying, I no longer need to prove anything. That's still ego proving something. Ironically, the harder you chase ego death, the more alive it becomes. It's like trying to bury a shadow with light. The brighter you shine, the sharper its outline gets. Bypassing works here as camouflage. When seekers speak of being above ordinary emotions, it often means they're protecting identity too. The spiritual self who's beyond it all. This persona feels safer than raw humanity. It trades vulnerability for purity points. Anger, jealousy, doubt, all get recast as evidence of lower vibration, so they're suppressed. But that very judgment is the ego defending its throne by dividing experience into holy and unholy. The self once built on pride now just wears compassion robes. This is where the arrogance of subtle superiority slips in. You can hear it in phrases like, they're still asleep, or, she's not ready for higher frequencies. The ego finds comfort in hierarchy. Every time we rank emotional states, we create separation, the opposite of awakening. Detachment turns into dismissal. Instead of we, It becomes those who get it versus those who don't. The illusion of enlightenment turns into social capital. Peace becomes a badge. The reason that trick works so well is psychological. The ego's job is to create stability through definition. It says, this is me, that is not. When awakening threatens that boundary, it panics. Rather than vanish, it rebrands. I am the self that has no self. Instant paradox, instant survival. The mind feels safe again because it still has something to be enlightened. The costumes change, the control stays. You can spot this defense in spiritual communities where humility becomes performance. People love saying they're just channels, pure vessels, or in service, while quietly checking if anyone noticed. It's no longer blatant pride, it's refined pride. The voice sounds soft, but the undertone says, look how egoless I am. The irony is painful and universal. None of us escape this pattern easily, because the structure of self-reference is baked into the brain. Awareness can't erase it, it can only keep revealing it. Now, some will argue that striving for egolessness isn't bad, that it motivates compassion. True, but when the goal becomes proving purity, growth stops. You start policing inner experience for anything unspiritual. Anger arises, you shame it. Desire returns, you analyze it to death. The ego's last defense is spiritual perfectionism, trying so hard to be conscious that consciousness turns rigid. The result isn't liberation, it's moral exhaustion disguised as enlightenment. Watch how language gives it away. I used to react, but now I just observe. Translation: I'm proud of how detached I seem. There's no malice in that. It's the psyche's relief at escaping chaos. But if detachment becomes identity, you stop being curious. Genuine awakening remains curious forever. Ego wants closure. The moment you think you've arrived, you've built another wall. This same pattern scales up collectively. Whole movements form around, we are the awakened generation. Sounds inspiring until you hear the subtext. Unlike everyone else. Suddenly compassion narrows, and spiritual discourse starts resembling ideology. The ego's defense multiplies through group identity, the tribe of the transcended. You see it in online rhetoric about 3D versus 5D consciousness, where people literally rank dimensions of awareness like corporate tiers. The lightworker LinkedIn. And there's another ego trick, mistaking avoidance for surrender. I no longer engage with negativity. At first glance, that looks wise. But real surrender would mean feeling what arises, not curating reality to stay comfortable. When someone says, I send them love and move on, sometimes that's healthy boundary. Other times, it's spiritual dissociation, stepping over conflict while claiming peace. The ego loves this move because it preserves image without risking intimacy. Inside relationships, it's especially sneaky. Let's say your partner expresses hurt, and you reply, you're projecting. You might be right, but it's also a subtle power play, positioning yourself as the conscious one. That exchange feels calmer but kills. Connection. Ego shielded itself with a vocabulary of awareness. Many couples in spiritual circles break down not from lack of insight, but from surplus of self-importance. They argue about who's more aligned. Enlightenment becomes the new scoreboard. Essentially, the ego fears annihilation, so it reinvents itself as the teacher, healer, or enlightened witness. It hides in service. You join causes, preach acceptance, guide others, all beautiful acts, unless they replace your own vulnerability. The moment purpose becomes protection, avoidance returns. The terrifying question is, who am I without being the evolved one? Sit with that, and you'll feel where ego still clings. The comfort of superiority can't be overstated. Believing you're further along relieves shame about not knowing. It rewrites insecurity as transcendence. I'm not disconnected, I'm choosing solitude. I'm not cold, I'm honoring sovereignty. The phrases are elegant bandages. They protect sensitive self-worth under a blanket of cosmic vocabulary. The healing comes only when we dare to admit how much we still crave being seen, loved, confirmed. That honesty punctures the illusion faster than any mantra. So how do we work with this defense without turning it into another self-attack? By noticing tone over title. When humility feels relaxed, not performative, you're probably touching authenticity. When compassion comes with curiosity rather than smug certainty, the ego's grip is loosening. The shift from teaching to learning again is the signpost of genuine awakening. The danger was never having an ego. It's pretending you graduated from it. Every enlightened figure kept one. They just stopped letting it drive. The Buddha still used the word, I. Ram Dass joked about his neuroses on stage. Awareness doesn't erase personality, it dethrones it. The ego becomes an instrument, not a director. The moment you stop defending its purity, humility returns naturally. And humility is the antidote to every ego trick. It says, "I don't know yet," even after years of practice. It listens instead of labeling. It admits when emotions still sting. True detachment doesn't mean disengagement. It means participation without possession. You can rage, grieve, laugh, then release, because no state defines you anymore. That fluidity terrifies the ego, which survives through fixed identity. But once you relax into impermanence, control isn't necessary. Practicing real detachment begins here. Observing the impulse to appear enlightened, smiling at it, and letting it pass. That simple honesty breaks the illusion faster than any doctrine. The ego can only play hide and seek in shadows. Awareness is daylight. Expose its tactics without judgment, and it becomes harmless. Ultimately, the ego's last defense is the belief that enlightenment is about being above human flaws. In truth, awakening brings you closer to them, with tenderness. You don't transcend pride by erasing it. You see it, laugh, and bow. The spiritual path ends where self-war ends, when even ego is included in compassion. Because the moment you can hold that trickster lovingly, it loses its teeth. And that's where real detachment begins. Not the numb kind, but the conscious, breathing freedom of being nothing special and utterly alive. Real detachment versus emotional numbness. Detachment and numbness, same look, totally different DNA. Both appear calm, measured, unreactive. But the difference lies in consciousness. Detachment is awareness without possession. Numbness is absence without awareness. One arises from presence, the other from escape. It's the still lake versus the drained one. Each reflects the sky, but only one contains life beneath the surface. The modern spiritual scene confuses them, so often that people stop trusting calm altogether, unsure if what they're feeling is peace or paralysis. The easiest test? Peace feels alive, numbness feels offline. Peace has texture, subtle movement, warmth around the edges. Numbness has static silence, a dull hum where emotion should be. Yet to an overstimulated nervous system, that blankness can sound like salvation. After chronic chaos, shutting down seems holy. That's why bypassing thrives. It sells sedation as serenity. Real detachment, however, doesn't minimize sensation. It holds it gently. You can feel pain fully without becoming pain itself. That's the strength of consciousness. Not insulation, but intimacy that doesn't drown you. Think of a monk sitting through discomfort, breath steady, but eyes alive. He's not frozen, he's participating in stillness. He can sense emotion rise and fall without grasping it. Now compare that to trauma detachment. The person whose face goes blank the second conflict arises. The body remains, but awareness has stepped out. The same exterior calm, opposite interior. One rooted in embodiment, the other in escape. You can see it in micro details. How they breathe, if their eyes track the room, whether shoulders soften or armor tighten. Enlightened detachment breathes. Numb detachment holds its breath. Here's a practical self-test. When pain appears, can you stay curious? Can you feel sadness in your chest and keep breathing? Or do you instantly analyze it into abstraction? If awareness stays connected to sensation, that's detachment. If awareness floats away into philosophy, that's avoidance. True detachment anchors deeper into the body. Numbness evacuates it. The irony is that both claim to be letting go. The difference lies in whether you're letting emotion pass through you or locking it out entirely. Authentic detachment includes empathy. You can witness someone's anger without absorbing it, not because you're cold, but because you recognize shared humanity. Numbness cuts that bridge. When you're numb, other people's emotions feel inconvenient, threatening, or irrelevant. The ego secretly rejoices. It's found its favorite narrative. I'm above this. But genuine detachment whispers, I'm part of this, just not entangled by it. That small shift transforms isolation into compassion. Detachment is often accused of being impersonal, yet the opposite is true. It releases personal grasp, so you can connect more honestly. Without personal agenda, listening becomes possible. Numbness, by contrast, replaces engagement with analysis. You listen to understand your role, rather than their reality. It's empathy managed through intellect. The heart stays behind glass, nodding wisely while remaining unreachable. We often idolize that distance, marveling at people who never get triggered. But some of those people simply haven't let life touch them in years. The cultural confusion runs deep. because modern life rewards composure. At work, in relationships, even online, the person who stays calm looks powerful. We're told, don't react, as if emotional expression equals weakness. But suppression eventually backfires. When numbness replaces detachment, you start mistaking tension for strength. You look stable while quietly suffocating under self-control. Then one day the system rebels, panic attacks, burnout, sudden emptiness, and we call it spiritual crisis. Often, it's just the soul begging to feel again. Let's flip it. What does authentic detachment feel like from the inside? Imagine heartbreak. The pain's real, penetrating, but there's space around it. You notice the ache, maybe even tears, but part of you stands softly witness. This too. You aren't suppressing emotion, you're giving it room. The tears become movement, not collapse. That tenderness, alive, responsive, non-defensive, is the mark of real detachment. It doesn't amputate emotion. It allows emotion to complete its cycle under supervision of consciousness. You end up more connected afterward, not less. Numbness, on the other hand, isolates. After heartbreak, instead of crying, you feel nothing. Friends applaud your maturity. You're handling it well. But inside, time stops. Songs lose meaning. Laughter feels distant. Even pride and composure tastes dull. That's not enlightenment. That's emotional frostbite. You avoided drowning, sure, but built your home on ice. This distinction matters because paths of awakening hinge on it. Most seekers mistake emotional neutrality for progress. In reality, neutrality without intimacy is disassociation polished to a shine. The spiritual challenge is to stay heart open while detached from outcomes. To remain touched but not torn apart. It's easy to love from distance. It's growth to love while standing inside the mess. That's where detachment meets devotion. Loving everything enough to let it exist as it is. Here's another tell. Detachment expands possibility. Numbness reduces it. When truly detached, curiosity thrives. You're willing to experience anything because nothing can enslave you. When numb, curiosity dies. You avoid novelty to prevent destabilization. One says, I can handle more. The other says, I can't handle again. Peace measured by how little disturbs you is fragile peace. Real freedom is being disturbable without disintegrating. Some people hear this and think the solution is to feel everything all at once. But that's not it. Detachment isn't drowning, it's grounded witnessing. You open channels gradually, so the body learns safety within sensation. That's why meditation, therapy, and movement practices help. They teach containment. Without containment, feeling can slip into overwhelm. With it, every wave educates instead of injures. Awareness without body equals theory. Awareness with body equals transformation. Culturally, we glorify stoicism because emotional repression is familiar. Generations taught, life goes on equated survival with virtue. So when spiritual teachings about detachment arrived, society misheard. Don't feel. But original texts meant, don't cling. Those are galaxies apart. Not clinging allows feeling to flow. Not feeling stops flow entirely. Western adaptations skipped the nuance and ended up worshipping numbness. We turned inner silence into emotional exile. To reclaim authenticity, we have to rehabilitate emotion's reputation. Feeling doesn't drag you backward, it grounds you in reality. Detachment simply prevents possession. You can hold anger the way you'd hold a crying child. Steady arms, open heart, no judgment. That's mastery. Numbness, in contrast, closes the nursery door and calls it peace. Which state do you think breeds wisdom? Even neuroscience backs this up. Genuine mindfulness activates integration networks between emotional and cognitive regions. Dissociation disables them. In scans, detached awareness shows synchrony, numbing shows fragmentation. So when spirituality strays toward avoidance, remember, it's literally anti-integration. That's why long-term bypassers often develop health symptoms. The body's pleading to be re-included. None of this demonizes calmness. Quiet is sacred when it follows expression, not replacement. The river that has flowed can rest clear and still. But if you dam it prematurely, stagnation breeds. Modern calmness often smells stagnant because it skipped movement. Ask yourself, did this peace arrive after release, or instead of it? The answer tells you everything. Practicing real detachment requires micro-honesty. Notice sensations instead of labels. Tight chest instead of I'm fine. Feel the body's language before the mind's story. Then stay. Each moment you remain present without suppressing or dramatizing, detachment evolves into compassion. And compassion, unlike numbness, connects you deeper to life. You realize neutrality isn't absence. It's an ecosystem where every feeling coexists without war. Ultimately, real detachment means being fully here with whatever is. Numbness, on the other hand, is being half here, half gone, present only with what's polite. One widens the heart, the other walls it off. The spiritual goal was never to build armor. It was to dissolve unnecessary defenses until sensitivity becomes strength. Because sensitivity, when trusted, isn't fragility. It's direct contact with truth. So if you ever wonder whether you're detached or detached from yourself, check for warmth. If presence holds tenderness, you're free. If presence feels suffocatingly blank, you've mistaken shutdown for serenity. Detachment breathes in rhythm with life. Numbness holds its breath, pretending not to care. One leads to awakening, the other to atrophy. And the choice, minute by minute, is whether you open or disappear. The work of integration. Integration starts exactly where you quit chasing better and finally allow yourself to just feel. It's not glamorous work. It doesn't sparkle on social media. Integration is the art of staying with what arises until it tells you its name. The modern seeker often craves transcendence, but the wiser soul learns to descend into the body, into the ache, into the gritty, unfiltered now. That descent is where enlightenment stops being a theory and becomes experience. Shadow work sits at the center of it. People throw the term around casually, but true shadow work isn't journaling about your flaws or reciting, "I love my darkness." It's noticing the moment your throat tightens during conflict and choosing not to flee. It's feeling shame boil up and, instead of replacing it with positive affirmation, breathing until shame softens into sadness. The practice isn't about fixing emotion. It's about letting emotion finish its natural cycle while remaining conscious. Integration means every exile, anger, jealousy, grief, is welcomed home without condition. Mindfulness of discomfort is the first tool. Everyone loves mindfulness when it brings peace. Few want it when it brings nausea or trembling. Yet that's where it matters most. When anxiety spikes, rather than controlling breath to make it vanish, you observe the twitch, the sweat, the flutter. Here's the body trying to protect me. You enter dialogue with sensation instead of declaring war on it. Over time, that gentle curiosity rewires the limbic system. The brain learns safety isn't the absence of emotion, but the ability to ride emotion consciously. Embodied awareness is the second. Most spiritual paths stayed neck up, analyzing, witnessing, narrating. Integration drags you below the chin. It asks, what does truth feel like in your spine? In your gut? The body carries stories language can't hold. A clenched jaw might contain decades of restrained anger. Trembling hands might be unspoken fear. Bringing attention, there is archaeology, uncovering fossils of emotions once frozen for survival. When awareness returns to those sites, warmth does too. Expression follows naturally, crying, shaking, even laughter, letting the nervous system discharge years of backlog. Liberation often sounds like sighing. Then comes trauma-informed curiosity. Not to label every twinge as trauma, but to understand where it came from and why it stayed. Integration cares about history. You ask, when did I first learn that? Grief was dangerous? Who taught me anger meant rejection? These questions don't seek blame, they seek timeline. The moment emotion meets understanding, defense loosens. The pattern stops being moral failure and becomes information. That shift from judgment to curiosity is spiritual alchemy in real time. The hardest skill is what teachers call the art of staying. We were trained to intellectualize pain, think through, plan through, talk through. Staying means resisting the exit. When heartbreak hits, let the body break in rhythm with it. Don't rush insight. Eventually, pain metabolizes into compassion on its own. Insight blooms after endurance, not before it. In that endurance, you remember the forgotten language of presence. Silence that isn't suppression, but sacred waiting. This is why cliché advice like feel to heal actually holds neurology behind it. Feeling completes feedback loops. When you permit tears or anger without analysis, hormonal cascades resolve naturally. Cortisol drops, oxytocin rises. The brain reassociates safety with expression. Integration literally changes chemistry. Meditation alone can't do that if it's used to mute emotion. Only embodied processing achieves closure. The divine doesn't need you to transcend biology. It's trying to move through it. And this process rarely looks orderly. Some days you'll feel profound release. The next, you'll wonder if you regressed. That oscillation is integration. Healing moves in spirals, not lines. Each revisit refines understanding until energy around an old wound no longer spikes. You can tell the story and still breathe fully. The goal isn't forgetting, it's remembering without flinching. A simple daily practice. Choose one uncomfortable sensation and map it without judgment. Maybe tightness behind ribs. Breathe there. Label physical facts, not stories. Warm, tense, flutter. Keep attention anchored until something shifts. A sigh, a tear, or quiet neutrality. That micro-moment teaches the psyche that presence equals safety. Multiply it over months, and emotional resilience becomes default. Integration isn't a weekend workshop. It's accumulated moments of staying. Another aspect often overlooked is relational repair. Integration doesn't end in solitude. It extends through connection. When you can hold your own discomfort, you stop demanding others regulate it for you. Relationships transit from codependence to co-witnessing. You begin listening without defending, speaking without performing. Embodied presence becomes contagious. Calm nervous systems synchronize, creating collective regulation we call empathy. True compassion isn't tolerance. It's resonance born from personal integration. Many teachers describe enlightenment as sitting in the mud while recognizing its lotus soil. That's not poetic metaphor, it's instruction. The mud represents emotion's density. Avoid it, and you grow roots nowhere. Sit in it long enough, and the nutrients feed clarity. Integration reframes difficulty as compost, the rot producing bloom. The practice isn't glamorous, but yields radiance impossible to fake. Let's ground it in a micro-story. Imagine you're heartbroken and instinct says, affirm your worth, visualize closure. Instead, you stay. You feel the hollow in your chest without trying to fill it. Nights stretch wide, tears arrive uninvited, memories replay. Slowly, amid exhaustion, a softer understanding breaks through. Heartbreak isn't punishment. It's proof of capacity to love. Compassion enters, not as concept but sensation, warmth where ache used to live. Months later, you meet others' pain with gentleness, not pity. That's integration, not borrowed wisdom, embodied truth. Integration also changes how you relate to failure. Old patterns measured growth by consistency. Integration measures growth by recovery speed. You still fall into reactivity, but awareness returns faster. You apologize sooner, breathe deeper, learn without self-shame. Each repair strengthens neural flexibility. Failure stops being evidence of inadequacy and becomes rehearsal for empathy. Eventually, the boundary between emotional work and spiritual practice dissolves. Meditation, movement, art, therapy, all become portals for the same purpose: reunion with disowned parts. The more you integrate, the less you fear contradiction. You can be peaceful and furious, grateful and grieving. The fuller spectrum, the nearer the wholeness. Enlightenment reveals itself not as detachment from emotion, but intimacy with every tone of it. This mindset also reshapes how we treat others' pain. When you've faced your shadow, you stop pathologizing theirs. You understand that everyone's defenses once saved them. That awareness crafts compassion sturdy enough for imperfection. Integrated people don't preach tolerance. They embody it through nervous systems that stay open amid discomfort. That's why presence heals more effectively than advice. Bodies communicate safety faster than words. Integration, then, isn't the final step. It's the ongoing rhythm of being alive consciously. Each moment invites inclusion. Inhale the pleasant, exhale the painful. Keep witnessing both until division dissolves. You realize awakening isn't floating above mud water, but breathing within it. Clear, alert, unafraid of residue. The lotus doesn't escape the swamp. It thrives because of it. This reframing turns avoidance into raw material. Life stops being a problem to fix and starts looking like clay for consciousness to sculpt. Discomfort signals depth being carved for greater joy. Integration teaches that transcendence isn't departure. It's expansion spacious enough to hold it all. When you live that truth, spirituality stops being escape and starts being embodiment. And as this personal integrity stabilizes, something beautiful happens, connection deepens. Because once you can hold your own shadows without flinching, you can finally meet others without masks. That's the bridge between inner work and collective compassion, the next horizon on this path. Compassion, not perfection. Modern spirituality's dirty little secret? It loves perfection almost as much as it pretends to be above it. Scroll through any high-vibration space and you'll find endless reminders to protect your peace, cut off negativity, and keep your frequency pure. On paper it sounds noble. Choose love, maintain boundaries, stay elevated. But beneath that glow hides a quiet rigidity. Perfection became our makeshift salvation. We started treating compassion like a luxury for those who've already purified themselves. The result is alarming. A generation of seekers fluent in the language of oneness, but fluent, too, in subtle exclusion. The danger of spiritual elitism is that it sneaks in disguised as discernment. You tell yourself you're merely preserving your energy, when really you're protecting your ego from being rattled by someone else's pain. High vibration only culture builds invisible walls, a gated community of enlightenment where rough emotions need an invitation. It begins innocently. You limit exposure to drama. Soon, you're filtering people not by character, but by the color of their mood. Entire friendships dissolve because one person dares to cry without a reframe. Compassion shrinks into etiquette. Send them love from afar. At first, this selective empathy feels empowering. Cutting off low-vibe interactions grants temporary peace. But it also sterilizes connection. Human relationship thrives on imperfection. The missteps, miscommunications, and messy repairs. When spirituality demands perpetual harmony, conflict becomes heresy. People start hiding discomfort behind performative calm. Relationships flatten into polite detachment. Everyone smiling while quietly starving for real intimacy. Without friction, there's no authenticity. Without authenticity, compassion can't take root. Compassion is messy by design. It dissolves hierarchy, forcing us to face our own fragility mirrored in others. That's why it's easier to preach love and light than to sit beside someone mid-breakdown. The first asks for vocabulary, the second asks for presence. Many healers skip that part because true empathy threatens the polished identity they've built. Sitting with another's pain means touching your own, and if you've bypassed yours, the mirror burns. Consider teachers who led through humanity, not holiness. Think of spiritual figures who admitted anger, doubt, or fatigue in public. Their power didn't diminish, it deepened. When Ram Dass joked about his neuroses, or Thich Nhat Hanh spoke about his early hatred during the war, they demonstrated compassion as shared vulnerability, not cosmic superiority. Their example dismantles the myth that enlightenment equals emotional perfection. They showed that the highest vibration is understanding, not avoidance. Authentic compassion involves risk. It exposes you to contamination by humanity, the very thing elitist spirituality fears most. Yet this contamination is where collective evolution happens. When you let someone's suffering touch you, your identity blurs, your self-importance thins. Suddenly the boundary between helper and helped collapses. You realize healing isn't a ladder, it's a circle. Everyone trades roles endlessly. One day you're the light, the next you're the flicker needing someone else's glow. Spiritual elitism, however, thrives on hierarchy. It promises purity, a life unsullied by lower emotions or unenlightened companions. Its vocabulary divides the world. Empath versus narcissist, healed versus unhealed, light versus shadow. These labels simplify complexity, turning human nuance into moral geometry. They allow you to feel superior while claiming humility. The tragedy is that superiority numbs precisely the faculty needed for awakening: compassion. A sealed heart can chant love forever and never know intimacy. True compassion lives in the cracks, those shared flaws we keep trying to edit out. It's the recognition that we all run the same ancient software: fear, desire, anger, longing. And none of those programs make us less divine. The awakened mind doesn't avoid this chaos, it sees through it. From that clarity arises patience, a tolerance for the mess that terrifies perfectionists. Compassion doesn't sanitize, it circulates in the dirt of real life. Helping a friend relapse, forgiving your own impatience, listening when every cell wants to fix. Notice how genuine compassion feels in the body. Warm expansion, slight ache, sometimes tears. It vibrates slower than bliss, but steadier than ecstasy. Elitism feels tight, chest lifted, jaw set, words rehearsed. One opens, the other braces. Recognizing that contrast is practical spirituality. The nervous system itself can tell fake peace from embodied empathy. When compassion replaces perfection, guilt softens too. You stop punishing yourself for being reactive or sad. Every emotion becomes another chance to practice inclusion. Instead of declaring failure, you ask, "Can I meet this?" Feeling kindly. Over time, that question rewrites your inner dialogue. Judgment turns curious. Awareness stops being surveillance and becomes friendship. Self-compassion births outer compassion. The two are inseparable. In community, This shift rewires everything. Instead of policing energy, people start holding space for fluctuation. One friend breaks down, another holds steady, not because they're higher, but because the roles will reverse next week. It's emotional ecology, a system where difference sustains balance. The group's vibration rises naturally, not by excluding darkness, but by metabolizing it together. That's spiritual evolution as collaboration, not competition. Real compassion needs boundaries, but not the brittle kind built from ego anxiety. A compassionate boundary says, I love you, and I can't participate in this pattern. The difference is tone, tender firmness versus moral superiority. Boundaries rooted in compassion heal. Boundaries rooted in purity punish. When you can set limits without shaming, you've transcended performative spirituality and stepped into relational enlightenment. The social media version of compassion struggles with that nuance. Online, empathy often gets mistaken for approval and boundaries for coldness. So people oscillate between overgiving and disappearing. Real compassion steadies that swing. It allows you to witness suffering without absorption, to speak truth without cruelty, to endure imperfection without fixing it. It's maturity disguised as softness. Enlightenment, then, reveals itself not through distance but intimacy. The more awakened you become, the more connected you feel, to grief, to injustice, to the stranger's tired eyes at the grocery line. Awareness widens until no one sits outside your circle of concern. That's why compassion, not perfection, marks genuine awakening. Perfection isolates, compassion integrates. One polishes the mirror, the other looks through it to see everyone reflected. Emotional evolution equals deeper connection, not separation. The more shadow you integrate, the more capacity you have to stand in another's storm without shutting down. You extend understanding even when behavior confuses you, because you remember your own chaos. That recognition dismantles superiority faster than any mantra. Suddenly low vibration, people become teachers, not threats. Every encounter becomes feedback for humility. If spirituality's purpose is union, then compassion is its only true measure. Detachment, mindfulness, energy work, all are tools whose worth dissolves the moment they sever empathy. Without compassion, awakening is just isolation with good marketing. But with it, awareness transforms from self-improvement into shared evolution. You stop trying to be pure light and start functioning as a prism, letting experience pass through you, bending it into understanding for everyone around. And that brings us to an uncomfortable but necessary truth. When compassion collapses, bypassing returns. If we keep chasing perfection, we end up emotionally anesthetized again. The cost isn't only personal, it's collective. Because a world full of spiritually bypassed individuals can't hold space for real healing. So the next question practically asks itself, what happens when we refuse to face this pattern and choose numb peace over authentic connection? The cost of staying bypassed. Spiritual bypassing first feels harmless, like overwatering your inner peace plant. But give it enough time and the roots rot. But over time, the price of that avoidance becomes steep. What feels like peace slowly morphs into paralysis, and what looks like maturity becomes emotional erosion. The tragedy is that many people won't recognize the cost until their inner world turns eerily silent. There's stillness, yes, but it's the stillness of disconnected circuitry. Lights on, no one home. Emotional stagnation dressed as peace is the first red flag. You tell yourself you've found balance, but enthusiasm fades. Colors dull. Joy produces polite smiles rather than laughter. Anger disappears, replaced by intellectual commentary about lessons and karma. The emotional graph flattens into straight-line calm. People call it stability, yet it's closer to atrophy. The nervous system has forgotten how to move between peaks and valleys. You can function, meditate, even advise others, but inside it's static. That emptiness brings cognitive dissonance. Society applauds composure, so you convince yourself this numbness is wisdom. You repost quotes about surrender, while secretly missing the mess that once made you feel alive. Part of you senses something's off, but you can't name it without shattering the image of peace you've built. So you double down, more silence, more detachment, less friction. It's a feedback loop where repression validates itself because nothing seems wrong, and nothing becomes the ideal. Psychologically, it's indistinguishable from mild depression, just wearing a wellness vocabulary. The bypasser loses access to motivation. Everything feels equally irrelevant. When joy arises, suspicion follows. I shouldn't get attached. When sadness knocks, shame answers. I thought I was beyond this. Over time, emotional range collapses into gray neutrality, the spiritual equivalent of living underwater. You can still breathe, but the oxygen is thin. This condition often leads to derealization, a sense of watching life rather than living it. Some describe it as permanent meditation mode, but it's more like persistent dissociation. The world feels distant, relationships transactional, taste and touch slightly muted. Instead of oneness, you experience detachment, so profound it borders on isolation. You mistake emptiness for enlightenment until loneliness starts echoing louder than mantra. In that isolation, the spiritual self begins to separate from the human self. The spiritual persona manages appearances, serene tone, ritual discipline, carefully chosen vocabulary. The human beneath still hungers, rages, aches, but is consistently exiled. You start dividing the day into roles: morning meditation saint, afternoon employee, evening ghost scrolling quotes about alignment. The split widens until authenticity feels dangerous. You wonder which self would survive if the mask slipped. Relationships suffer first. When emotional honesty becomes low vibration, intimacy decays. Friends stop confiding in you because they fear being judged for negativity. Partners feel unseen, sensing that your presence is courteous but not connected. You listen, nod, offer cosmic reassurance. Everything's unfolding as it should, while avoiding actual empathy. Eventually they stop reaching out, mistaking your distance for superiority. In truth, you're terrified. If you let their pain in, yours might surface too. Then comes the exhaustion. Maintaining spiritual composure 24/7 requires constant suppression, a full-time job for the psyche. Every unspoken emotion weighs like static in the body. Muscles stiffen, digestion falters, insomnia creeps in. The body, tired of silence, starts shouting through symptoms: chronic fatigue, migraines, mysterious aches. Medical tests come back clean, leaving you bewildered. But it isn't illness. It's the physical residue of everything you refused to feel finally demanding airtime. Financial and vocational realms aren't immune either. Bypassing dulls ambition. You rationalize stagnation as detachment from material desire. I'm learning to just be. But sometimes just being masks fear of failure. Without emotional engagement, curiosity dies, and creativity starves. Work loses meaning because inspiration sprouts from feeling, not avoidance. You can't channel passion while anesthetized to pain. The same shield that blocks sorrow blocks genius. Spiritually, the cost is even heavier. Bypassing halts evolution. Growth requires friction, conflict between known and unknown. When you construct a bubble of perpetual positivity, you remove the catalyst for transformation. The ego, disguised as peacekeeper, ensures nothing challenges its control. Over time, your practice starts looping. Same meditations, same affirmations, same comfort zone. You call it stability, it's actually stasis. Enlightenment becomes maintenance rather than discovery. There's also social fallout. Communities built on bypassing breed conformity. Because dissent equates to low energy, genuine dialogue disappears. Members echo each other's optimism while suppressing doubt. When suffering arises, instead of compassion, you get diagnosis. You attracted that. Collective numbness forms, smiling faces masking silent despair. The group's harmony feels sacred, but functions like emotional quarantine. One person's honesty can shatter the illusion, so truth becomes taboo. Internally, guilt festers. You secretly judge yourself for still struggling, wondering why years of practice haven't erased fear. Shame whispers that you're fraudulent, preaching light while feeling dark. To maintain credibility, you isolate further, meditating harder, forcing gratitude through gritted teeth. The harder you chase purity, the more contaminated you feel. And so the cycle tightens, denial reinforcing denial until the soul feels trapped inside its own spiritual vocabulary. What makes this state so insidious is its respectability. Unlike overt self-destruction, bypassing wins applause. People envy your calm, seek your advice, call you inspiring. External validation cements internal decay. You start believing your own brochure, while intuition screams behind the curtain. It's the quiet tragedy of appearing awakened, while slowly dying of disconnection. Long-term, this pattern creates existential void. When every emotion is filtered, life loses narrative arc. You no longer experience growth, just repetition. Without emotional contrast, even miracles feel mundane. Eventually, despair sneaks in wearing enlightenment's mask. Nothing matters, all is. 1. That sentence sounds profound, but hides nihilism. True unity feels intimate, Bypassing's version feels anesthetic. The difference is warmth. Unity melts barriers, bypassing builds glass walls. The psychological toll often culminates in burnout or breakdown. The body, unable to uphold suppression, rebels. Tears come unexpectedly, rage erupts, spiritual language fails. Though devastating, this collapse is grace disguised. The facade crumbles, so the human can breathe again. Many describe it as losing faith, but it's actually faith maturing, shifting from dogma of detachment to trust in raw experience. The breakdown is an invitation to reintegrate everything exiled. That reintegration hurts. When buried emotion resurfaces, it burns through the numb shell like thawing frostbite, tingling, painful, life-restoring. You might cry for days, question your path, even resent past teachers. It's messy redemption, undoing years of emotional exile. But on the other side lies vibrancy, the return of laughter that surprises you, tears that cleanse rather than collapse. Consciousness widens to include what it once feared. Ultimately, the real price of bypassing is this: you lose intimacy with life itself. You trade authenticity for serenity, connection for control, aliveness for composure. You become curator of empty peace. The body stops dancing, the heart stops breaking, which means it also stops opening. The world becomes observation rather than participation. It's safer, yes, but sterile. The key takeaway is simple yet uncomfortable. Bypassing is escapism with divine branding. It sells avoidance as transcendence, serenity without surrender, control disguised as acceptance. The invoice arrives later, in loneliness, apathy, or spiritual disillusionment. But the good news is that awakening doesn't demand exile from emotion. It demands inclusion through it. The way back to real peace isn't retreating from pain. It's feeling so fully that pain transforms into presence. Because true awakening doesn't hover above life. It breathes among heartbreaks and contradictions. It's humanity remembered, not erased. And when you finally stop bypassing and start listening, enlightenment stops being theory. It becomes the sound of your own heartbeat returning after years of sacred silence. Awakening through wholeness. Enlightenment isn't the flight from emotion. It's the reunion with everything you tried to leave behind. The final irony of the spiritual path is that the destination isn't some remote peak of perpetual calm. It's right here, in the grit of being human. Wholeness was never lost. It was just divided by fear and perfectionism, labeled low vibration, exiled under mantras. Real awakening is simply remembering that nothing disqualifies you from the sacred. Not rage, not longing, not even despair. When awareness includes every piece, duality fades. The light you once chased now exists inside the darkness you once resisted. You realize that growth never meant polishing the soul until flawless. It meant expanding spaciousness until everything fits. The tears, the laughter, the messy contradictions become evidence of consciousness, not proof against it. This recognition dismantles the oldest illusion, that being spiritual means being spotless. It never did. It means being transparent enough for the divine to shine through the cracks. We've spent decades glorifying transcendence, but transcendence minus embodiment creates ghosts, people floating above their lives. Integration grounds the divine back into muscle, heartbeat, breath. The enlightened state isn't dissociative calm. It's awake participation in constant change. Everything is one, only matters when you can extend that unity to your frustration in traffic, your grief at loss, your tenderness when words fail. Awareness becomes compassion the moment it touches real emotion. And this is the invitation now. Stop curating yourself into purity. Let the rage educate you. Let shame point toward the boundary where love still fears to reach. Every emotion is a messenger from the parts still waiting to be welcomed home. You don't transform by deleting those voices. You transform by listening until their language becomes music. Awakening through wholeness isn't an achievement. It's a surrender. The more you allow, the lighter it all becomes. Not because weight vanishes, but because resistance does. This path strips hierarchy from spirituality. No one sits higher. Everyone sits inside the same unfolding mystery, learning to breathe through it. The teacher's tears are as holy as the student's breakthroughs. Enlightenment is plural. It happens between hearts willing to stay open. When judgment softens into curiosity, compassion becomes the natural climate of consciousness. That's what the mystics meant when they said love is awareness recognizing itself. So maybe we stop chasing ascension and start practicing descent. Back into bodies, into feelings, into empathy that doesn't need perfection. First, the ego calls that regression. The soul calls it reunion. The goal was never to transcend being human. It was to experience humanity so fully that divinity has nowhere left to hide. Feeling doesn't make you less spiritual. It makes you real. It reconnects circuitry long numbed by ideals of serenity. Each tear rewires truth back into the system. That's the silent miracle. The moment you stop escaping, you wake up exactly where you are, and it's enough. Challenge yourself now. What emotion have you labeled too low, too messy, too dangerous? Sit with it tonight. Ask what it's been trying to teach. Comment below and tell me what shows up. You might discover that the feeling you feared most was your missing teacher all along.